December 1943. The skies above northern Germany were cold, gray, and filled with the sound of death. A lone American B-17 Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was limping home after a bombing run over Bremen. The mission had gone horribly wrong. Anti-aircraft fire had ripped holes through its wings. 2 engines were dead. The nose was shattered. The tail gunner was bleeding out. Inside, the young crew, barely out of their teen, were covered in smoke, oil, and blood. Their pilot, 21-year-old Lieutenant Charles Brown, gripped the controls with trembling hands. His first combat mission, and it had already become a nightmare. The bomber's oxygen system was damaged. Temperatures dropped below freezing, and the plane struggled to stay in the air. Every second felt like an eternity. The crew prayed silently, hoping the German fighters had given up the chase. But death was never far behind in the skies of 1943. Through the shattered glass of the cockpit, Brown suddenly saw it, a dark shape, emerging from the clouds, sleek, fast, deadly. A German. Messerschmitt Bf 109. In that moment, Brown knew it was over. His guns were jammed. His men were too wounded to fight. There was nothing left to do but wait for the end. The German fighter closed in, its machine guns glinting in the cold light of dawn. Inside that plane sat Franz Stigler, one of Germany's most skilled pilots, a veteran ace with 22 confirmed kills. He spotted the crippled bomber, smiled faintly, and began his dive. Another victory, he thought. The war had made killing routine, but as he approached, something strange happened. Through his gun sight, Franz saw faces. Not enemies, boys. Young, terrified, exhausted faces. The tail gunner slumped in his seat, barely alive. Bullet holes covered the fuselage. The plane's rear door was half torn away. He saw the pilot trying to keep the bomber steady with one arm, blood seeping from his jacket. This was no dogfight. This was slaughter. Franz's finger hovered over the trigger. One squeeze and it would all be over. But a memory came to him. The words of his old commander, Gustav Rödel, who once told him, "You shoot a man in a parachute, you'll answer to me." It was a code of honor, a reminder that even in war, there were lines you don't cross. Franz eased his finger away from the trigger. He couldn't do it. Not like this. He pulled up beside the bomber, flying wingtip to wingtip. The American crew stared in shock. The enemy was right there, close enough to see the expression on his face, but he wasn't firing. Brown, confused and terrified, shouted, "He's toying with us!" But Franz wasn't mocking them. He was studying the damage, realizing that these men were already dying. He gestured with his hands, signaling them to turn west, toward England. Brown didn't understand. Franz pointed again, mouthing the words, "Go home." For a few seconds, neither moved. Then Brown nodded weakly. The bomber turned slightly, its remaining engines sputtering. Franz flew beside them, matching their speed, staying close. Below them, German anti-aircraft. Guns spotted the bomber and began to aim. But they held their fire. The gunners on the ground saw the German fighter escorting the American plane. They couldn't believe it. A Luftwaffe ace protecting an enemy? It made no sense. But Franz didn't care. He guided the bomber through the clouds, past the coast, until the icy waters of the North Sea shimmered below. For miles, they flew together, 2 enemies bound by something far greater than war. When they reached the open sea, Franz knew it was time to turn back. He moved his plane alongside the bomber's cockpit, looked directly into Brown's eyes. and raised his hand in salute. Then he banked away, disappearing into the gray clouds. Inside the B-17, silence. No one spoke. The crew simply watched as the German fighter faded into the distance. The man who could have ended their lives had chosen not to. When Ye Olde Pub landed back in England, ground crews stared in disbelief. The bomber looked like it had flown through hell. Holes the size of fists covered the fuselage. Parts of the tail were missing. Yet somehow they had made it home. When Brown reported what happened, his commanding officer listened carefully, then said, "Don't tell anyone." They didn't want stories spreading that the enemy had shown mercy. The war needed hatred to survive, so Brown kept quiet. For decades, he said nothing. The secret stayed locked inside him. But the memory of that German pilot, that face, that salute, never left him. Years later, after the war, Brown often found himself looking at the sky, wondering who that man was. Had he survived the war? Was he still alive? In the late 1980s, now an old man, Brown decided he had to find him. He wrote letters to veteran organizations, aviation magazines, and German newspapers, describing what had happened. Months turned into years, but there was no answer. Then one day, a letter arrived from Canada. The first line said, "I was the one who didn't shoot you down." Franz Stigler had survived the war and moved to Vancouver. He had never spoken about that day either. When he saw Brown's story in a newsletter, he knew instantly. It was the bomber he had spared. The two men arranged to meet. When they finally did, nearly 50 years after that day in the sky, they embraced like brothers. Brown's wife later said, "It was like he had found a long-lost family member." Franz told him that sparing the bomber had been one of the hardest decisions of his life. If his superiors had found out, he would have been executed. But he said, "I couldn't shoot you. You were already defeated. To kill you then would have been murder." From that day forward, the two men remained close friends. They called each other often, spent holidays together, and shared their story with schools, historians, and veterans. When people asked what they had learned from war, they both said the same thing, that humanity is stronger than hate. As the years passed, their bond deepened. They would attend air shows together, standing side by side, the American bomber pilot and the German fighter ace, proof that even enemies can find peace. When journalists asked Franz if he regretted his decision, he smiled and said, "No, I would do it again. Even if it cost me my life, Charles." Brown said that Franz Stigler was the kind of man he wished everyone could meet. A reminder that even in the darkest places, light can exist. In 2008, Franz Stigler passed away. A few months later, Charles Brown followed. Friends said it was as if they couldn't live without one another. They are now remembered together, two men on opposite sides of a terrible war, united forever by one act of compassion. Their story remains one of the most powerful moments of World War II, a true example that honor and mercy can rise above chaos. When you look at old photos of the sky over Europe, the smoke, the fire, the endless destruction, it's hard to imagine kindness surviving there. But somehow, in the middle of all that madness, it did. One man saw his enemy not as a target, but as another human being. That single choice saved 10 lives, and changed 2 forever. In the end, it wasn't the bullets or the medals that defined them. It was the simple act of mercy that made them heroes. So remember this, not every victory comes from pulling the trigger. Sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is choose not to.